now the latest around the wide world of tropics. It's your live tropical weather bulletin for August 21st, 2020. Hello everyone, we have a tropical weather bulletin live today. Going over briefly the tropical weather outlook, we have Invest 90W in the Western Pacific, a high odds of development system right now, potentially significant typhoon later this week for the Western Pacific Basin. We have an area of interest in the Atlantic coming off the African coast right now. It's a 50% chance of development in the next 5 days. Tropical Depression 13L passing nearby the Lesser Antilles. Tropical storm watches in place with that. Tropical Depression 14L having tropical storm warnings in place in parts of Central America, and Tropical Storm Genevieve pulling away from Baja California, but still having warnings in place at the time being. I'm here with a large team tonight to discuss everything. We got Ethan, Ami, Michael, Kay, Ryan, Xavier, and Wyatt. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Good evening.
And you forgot Yucatanator.
Yeah, I got you, dude. So we have a lot going on right now in the tropics. A lot of active systems. I have 13L on the screen right now for people if they want to just briefly go over what we've been seeing with the latest. I know there's recon in the plane at the time right now.
Well, I guess I'll go ahead and stay here. Tropical Depression 13. Well, it looks really unorganized, and the recon has been in the system, I believe, and they've gotten some readings of flight level near 45 knots. That does not mean that that's a tropical storm, however, because SFMR readings are well below that, around 20 knots. That's what I've been seeing.
Yeah, that's about right, really. The latest recon passes from what I was saying, again, like you said, those around 45 knots at maximum flight level, but those SFMR readings really maxing out around 30 knots or so. So no tropical storm from this system yet, but a potential hurricane threat for portions of the United States, Bahamas, and Greater Antilles as we head into the weekend at this point in time, really. Although it is notable the intensity forecast is much more uncertain than usual due to potential land interaction with the Lesser Antilles and Greater Antilles especially, along with potential dry air entrailment, and even interactions with the next system, which is 14L right now. They found the center further south and east than they were expecting a bit earlier today, and they're now expecting a landfall as a tropical storm in Central America.
I think that's pretty reasonable.
Yep.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, and that's on the screen right now. The track is quite an unusual one, really, because you see it make landfall in Central America, then quickly curve back off to the northwest, cross over the Yucatan, and then emerge back over and potentially head towards the western Gulf Coast states of Texas, Louisiana as we head towards days 4 and 5. Again, though, another uncertain intensity forecast here because indications are showing that shear should be increasing as we get towards the latter part of the forecast period, which would typically indicate weakening with the system, but its potential interactions with 13L right now down the line leave that area more murky than we'd really like to see right now to get a better, clear view of what impacts could be for that area. We also have Genevieve right now moving away from Baja California, but still bringing impacts there right now.
Currently on my screen strat is Tropical Storm Genevieve right now. There is a tropical storm warning in effect for the Baja California Peninsula from Todos Santos to Cabo San Lauraro on the western coast. Maximum sustained winds, according to the National Hurricane Center, are 70 miles per hour. However, recon ratings do not support that, and I think it's slightly weaker, around 65 miles per hour. Nonetheless, rapid weakening is forecast, and Genevieve is forecast to weaken to a tropical depression around 36 hours from now, and weaken down to a 20-knot post-tropical cyclone in around 48 hours from now. So, cooler waters are taking its toll on the once mighty Genevieve, which was a Category 4 at peak, and a beautiful one at that. But it's just a shell of what it used to be now.
And quite fortunate that it's weakened at this pace before it was getting towards land, really. You know, initially there was expectations this could get as high as 150 mile an hour sustained winds. It never really lived up to that, though, despite being an extremely powerful storm.
Yeah, what really happened during Genevieve with its peak is because Genevieve was so large and so huge, its outflow in front of the storm itself literally drained up all the warm waters that were forecasting to help Genevieve's core out and get its intensification up, but unfortunately that didn't materialize, and luckily Baja California Peninsula got a weaker storm than what was forecast.
Yeah. And then the last really active invest tonight, really, I know Kay's been watching this one pretty closely because a lot of the models are showing potentially really weird things, is Invest 90W in the Western Pacific. A significant amount of models potentially making this a pretty strong typhoon within the next 5 days, with potential impacts really ranging from Shanghai to Japan and the Koreas.
Absolutely. I'm pulling up the HWRF model right now to see what it predicts. It is currently forecasting a low-end Category 4 out of 90W, which could be quite concerning. And it does track it very slowly just north of Okinawa. And
the strange thing about that forecast, though, is that it rapidly intensifies it in the northern East China Sea, where the temperatures in the sea aren't that warm, and it's unlikely to support such rapid strengthening.
Yeah, I mean, we're really going to have to wait and see what happens with that one once it gets a close center up, which is likely now. If I'm not mistaken, someone here confirmed just recently that a tropical cyclone formation alert had just come out for, was it 90W, right before we went live.
Yes,
So
that
they are,
is in effect.
yeah, so they are expecting development of that system relatively in the near future. Although its exact track, we were having a conversation earlier, Kay said directly, would range potentially from Shanghai to Japan and the Koreas. So there's a lot of areas that would need to monitor this because that exact point is not very clear.
Now, Strat, I don't know if it's possible for you, but could you perhaps pull up my forecast cones that I made?
I don't think I'm going to be able to do that right now because I'd have to pull up new scenes, but they're pretty similar to the National Hurricane Centers as a whole, if I'm not mistaken.
I can screen share them.
Okay, that's great.
That's the best way to do it.
The general forecast that I am giving for both of these systems right now, I'm forecasting Tropical Depression 14 to really struggle over the next few days due to, in the Gulf of Mexico at least, due to its proximity to 13, which is forecast to be in the Gulf of Mexico at the same time. But it's just a matter of time because it's quite a curious situation what we've got going on in the Gulf of Mexico. You have two scenarios. The first scenario is you have Tropical Depression 13 coming from the east and is a much stronger storm when it hits Florida, and ultimately that'll weaken 14 and cause a much weaker storm, which is good for Louisiana and Texas, but that's also bad news for Florida and Mississippi and Alabama per se. However, the sides could also flip. 14 could be stronger and 13 could be weaker. That would mean more bad news for the Yucatan Peninsula, Texas, and Louisiana. That'd be good news for Florida. So it certainly bears watching over the next few days.
Not to mention that there's also a 50% area of interest coming off of the Africa right now. There's an area of interest back there as well.
Yeah, and that's actually in the two really quick along the National Hurricane Center's areas. Let me see if I can pull that up really quick in general. The 5-day graphical outlook from the National Hurricane Center lines it up pretty well right here. They're not really expecting too much of it in the next 2 days, or at least the next 24 hours when it really emerges off the African coastline. But they are expecting about a coin flip, really, for this thing to develop in between the latitude of Cabo Verde to about 37 degrees west. So we could have a real MDR system pop up that we haven't really seen too many of form that far east this year to date, despite the 14 tropical depressions that we've already had before the month of August is even over at this point in time. It's really been a crazy experience for everyone.
Currently on my screen, Strat, I have my forecast cone for Tropical Depression 14. I do forecast it to become a tropical storm in around 12 hours from now. That I say is pretty much certain. And then due to land interaction, due to its unorganized nature, I do forecast it to briefly weaken to a tropical depression and then regain strength up to 50 miles per hour, which is 10 miles per hour lower than the National Hurricane Center's forecast. But the reason that I have it being that low is because of Tropical Depression 13. I'm forecasting that to be an 85 mile per hour Category 1 hurricane at landfall. I think that this is the most likely outcome as of now. Some models do take it weaker, most notably being the GFS and the Euro, and some models do take it significantly higher, the HWRF and the H1 being an example of that. So both of these systems bear close watching over the next few days as they push towards land, and could deliver quite some significant impacts to those land areas.
Yeah. And I guess really the only unfortunate thing that we really have to deal with both of these systems, other than, of course, the potential land impacts, is that a lot of the intensity forecasts for both of them, as specifically stated in the National Hurricanes Forecast discussions, are more unclear than usual, not just because of their interaction with each other, but also because of their potential land interactions, which make things more out of the very short term, a bit more murky. So there is not only the forecast cone of uncertainty, but we're also looking at potential significant intensity variances down the line. But, of course, we got to deal with those as they come. For now, though, we have a lot of people in the chat right now that probably are going to want to ask some questions that I'm sure everyone here will be able to answer some of. So if you have any questions, start your message with Force13 in text or at Force13. Lights up your message in a nice bright orange for us, makes it easier for us to see, and allows us to engage everyone at once really in a nice conversation. So throw them in if you want.
Yeah, and
very helpful.
Hold up, before we get underway though, I do want to point out something about 13L from something I saw in one of the chat rooms. Is that the HWRF model, after it makes land in fall in Florida, is predicting a major hurricane to possibly make landfall in Pensacola.
Yeah. Yeah, we got the model intensity spread out on the screen right now. I don't think the 18Z HWRF does that quite yet, but it does bring it up to a strong category 2. It's definitely on the higher end, with the CTC2 being the only one a bit higher than that right now. The official NHC forecast is minimal hurricane for time.
That's not the proper HWRF.
Oh, okay. Well, the model spread as a whole is being a bit wonky with this system, of course, because of the higher than usual uncertainty. But of course, something like that's technically not outside the realm of possibility. You know, it is specifically noted that the general forecasts are low confidence because of the potential risks of land interaction. So if you see a smaller storm move north and not have direct impacts of land, and I'll actually pull up Ethan's screen share really quick because it does a good job at showing this with 13L, if you want to go to that really quick. If it really stays north as a smaller system and doesn't entrail dry air from any of the greater Antilles Islands with their higher topographic regions, it could have the chance to become very strong in the high sea surface temperatures and ocean heat content. But if it stays a bit further south or entrails more dry air, it's going to struggle a lot more. And we got a lot of questions coming in right now. Someone's saying...
Yeah, I'm looking... Go ahead, Strat.
Yeah, I was just going to say, because we've talked about a bit of intensity, I want to get to the chat as well. Someone's saying... which system will form first in the Atlantic? I think they're talking about getting to tropical storm strength. What do you think? It'd be 13L or 14L?
Currently, I think, name storm regards, I think certainly tropical depression 13 will get there first. 14 looks much more disorganized than 13 looks. Well, they're both really unorganized, but I think 14 is going to get there first.
Yeah. And I think it is important to note, though, you know, people talk a lot about the names, but in a scenario like this where you have two potential storms impacting land in the very near future, the exact name that they have doesn't really matter too much, other than to note that one of them is gaining organization a bit quicker than the other, and maybe at least temporarily having to put some extra emphasis on that. But both of these are potentially significant systems for land. Tropical storm warnings and watches are in place for a reason. Another question right now. Let's see. What is the large convection off the coast of Africa that could be an area of interest soon? I think we went over this briefly, but I'll bring back up the forecast 5-day outlook from the National Hurricane Center. It already is an AOI with a 50% chance of development in the next 5 days. I don't know if people here have been tracking that one too closely, but if anyone wants to talk about that one, that'd be really nice as well.
Well, further back, the Euro had very strong support for it. It's backed off a little, but both the GFS and the European are suggesting that it could track long range across the Atlantic and become something significant in the Western Atlantic, similarly to what 13 has done. So we could be looking at a repeat situation for the similar areas in around 10 days' time.
Man, this season really just doesn't want to let up onto us, but, you know, the MJO's moving over. We got better Kelvin waves as well. A lot of supportive activity for potentially significant systems as we head into peak season, which is very unfortunate. It's just the facts of this year, which has already been extremely active, Still the fastest to the K name right now, and if either of these systems form in the next day or two, they'd both be the earliest L and M storms on record too. Someone's saying, what are the chances of 14 hitting Louisiana? And I'll pull up the little floater of it along with the track. It is in the 5-day cone of uncertainty, so landfall there is definitely possible. And if you're there, you should be keeping an eye out on this for the latest information regarding the system. I don't know if anyone has anything else to add about that as well.
Something I do note model-wise is they've really been all over the place when it comes to 14L's track in the Gulf of Mexico. It really could go anywhere from near the Mexico-Texas border all the way over to New Orleans, hence that big cone of uncertainty. But the general consensus right now, both by Force 13's forecast and the National Hurricane Center's forecast, is a landfall near Cameron, Louisiana. Cameron, Texas is around that area, which, if I do recall, is where Hurricane Rita made landfall back in 2005.
Just about.
It is very similar, but it's unlikely to be anywhere near that strength when it gets there.
Yeah.
Talking about the uncertainty, because it's a very complex interaction that's going to take place between a trough, the Bermuda high, another high over Central America, and 13 itself as it moves towards the Gulf area. There's a lot of factors at play, and the models are struggling with all the different systems that are going on here.
Yeah, and I think one of the best emphases of that is the 5-day tropical storm force wind speed probability thing from the National Hurricane Center as the last update, because you can see the 20% odd marks from both 14L and 13L merging around 25 degrees north and 87 degrees west. So these systems could be in pretty close proximity to each other by day 5, and the interaction between the two, along with their potentially complex land interactions, are making forecast intensities and even locations when, at least with 14L, the center isn't the best to find. They shifted significantly south and west in the latest update. A bit harder to pin down the exact location, but again, that cone of uncertainty is there for a reason. Significant portions of Louisiana are in it, so watch the system very closely for the next few days. A question about 13L as well, I'm sure a lot of people can answer this, is potential impacts for Alabama heading towards the system. We'll say parts of the very southeastern tip of the state are technically in the 5-day cone of uncertainty right now, but most of the state, it's probably still a bit too early to tell other than to keep an eye on it, right, guys?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Absolutely.
There is still quite some spread in the model guidance for 13 right now. I would just keep a really close eye on it if you live on 13, if you live really anywhere in the eastern Gulf Coast.
Yeah, I mean, look, unfortunately, we can give as much information about these as both can, with these images right now on the screen, you can actually see the 8 p.m. update with the actual location maximum sustained winds, 35 miles an hour at 17 degrees north, 55.5 degrees west. Especially once we get past day 3, though, at least for 13L, in terms of intensity, it's really unclear because of the potential land interactions with Hispaniola and Cuba. And then also 14L has got to deal with multiple land masses in Central America and Mexico right now. So definitely keep an eye on these very closely. You see the intensity model spread on the bottom for 13L there for a reason. Some of them has it as a very significant hurricane at day 5, while others have it as a very minimal tropical storm. So I will say if you're in the United States or really in the Caribbean and not under a watch yet, you should be keeping track of this very closely. If you're in a watch, you should be taking the proper precautions and preparations to what your local officials are telling you to do right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Currently on my screen, Strat, I have pulled up the model guidance for Tropical Depression 13. You'll see on the intensity, which is this top left screen here, you'll see that there's quite a split in the models, with the GFS, which is that red line, forecasting it to remain quite weak, and that I assume would result in a lot of dry air entanglement up in the center and up in the storm's outflow, and in the storm's environment would keep it relatively weak. That'd be the best scenario to happen. However, the HMON, which is that lime green line, the CTCX, which you should never pay attention to, and the HWRF, which is that blue line, both take it up to a major hurricane, and that is ultimately feasible, as sea surface temperatures, as you can see, are forecast to continue to rise and rise and rise all the way up to Florida landfall. And believe it or not, they will continue to rise even after the Florida landfall.
Yep.
Yeah,
and
we
I do
definitely
wanna
can't
point
rule
out-
out a major.
Yeah, I mean, overall shear
Yeah, this
aloft
is-
with the system is going to be pretty light through most of the next 5 days, along with the sea surface temperatures not just rising as it approaches the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos, but also ocean heat content. So how far deep those warm waters go is also going to rise in the depth of those as we get closer to the Bahamas as well. There's really a lot of warm water that goes really deep below the surface. If the storm moving slower, that would be a much more important factor because of the potential risk of upwelling. Right now, at least, though, this thing is still forecast to be moving pretty quickly between days 4 and 5. So if there's any saving grace, if this is a unusually strong storm, if it could get up to major hurricane status, which is a possibility indicated by some of the models, if that unfortunately happens, it'll still likely be moving pretty quickly. A question a lot of people have been asking this actually really quick about a Fujiwara effect between the two systems, if you guys want to discuss that as well.
I don't see that happening. Now, Strat, there's one important thing that I'd just like to note real quick about 13. If this storm is a strong hurricane in the southeastern Bahamas moving towards Florida, then I'd say that it's almost guaranteed that we'll be seeing a very strong Florida landfall. And here's my reasoning. If you were to draw a box from Miami over to Andros Island, south to Cuba, and back over to the Florida Keys, ocean heat content in that area is absolutely ridiculous. There's a lot of ocean heat content in those very warm waters, and that would likely support a very strong storm making landfall in Florida. So that certainly bears watching very closely.
Not to mention the fact that there's going to be pretty low shear in that area at the time, it looks like, according to some models as well.
And Ethan, the stronger the system, the more jog to the north, correct?
Yes. The stronger it is, the more north it'll get from land interaction. But the models, as you can see track-wise, are pretty close-knit in where the storm's going to go. It's just a question of if it's on the southern end, is just how much land interaction is it going to get, which the GFS thinks that it's going to get a lot. But the HWRF and HMON, you can see, are on that northern side, which would likely lead to a much stronger storm.
Yeah, and a lot of it's also going to come down to, its organization too, because even if it's a bit further north, this spread is definitely further north than last night, which had a lot more models bringing this system over Hispaniola and Cuba. If it's not very well organized, it could potentially entrail some more dry air, and that could be a very significant inhibitor. That was also noted in the National Hurricane Center's forecast discussion. It is also important to note, just in general, though, that unfortunately this is a relatively low confidence forecast by everyone, really, just because of the uncertainty aloft with both of those. But always important to keep in mind that there is the potential hurricane threat for the Bahamas, Turks and Caicos, and portions of the southeastern United States along the Gulf Coast and Florida as we head into early next week and the rest of this weekend right now.
Now, looking over to 14L here, the intensity guidance is quite fair on what the storm's going to do. It'll probably remain as a tropical storm for its entirety of its life cycle, which is not what we want to see for Florida. This is a stronger storm out of 13. But regarding 14L, sea surface temperatures are supposed to remain relatively the same up to its Yucatan Peninsula landfall, which is why you see this drop-off here is when it's supposed to make landfall in the Yucatan Peninsula on the 23rd of August. Then after that, sea surface temperatures will probably rise a little bit due to the Gulf of Mexico's waters being really warm right now. But as you can see, wind shear is forecast to absolutely rise because there's going to be this trough over Texas that's going to dip down into the Gulf of Mexico. And it's going to move up to the northeast, leading up toward the Florida Panhandle, Georgia, South Carolina area. This is going to cause weakening of 14L, and hence why my forecast does show it weakening down to a near minimal tropical storm before making landfall in Louisiana.
Yep. And someone asked a question. This is just more generally cyclone based, and I'm sure multiple people here can answer this just to bring a better description. We talk a lot about wind shear and stuff. What causes wind shear specifically?
Wind
There's a lot of
shear.
factors. There's a lot of factors that can cause wind shear. You can either have, like I just said, a trough, which is a frontal zone move through that can induce wind shear. Sometimes when you have wind shear set up like that like we can use Ernesto for an example. I mean, not Ernesto, Eduard. We can use that for an example. It got baroclinic forcing from that wind shear and it had a blip of convection, and then it helped it intensify to a tropical storm. You can also have other tropical cyclones generate wind shear because of their outflow. That can also happen too.
Yeah. Generally, I think the best description of it, it really depends on the direction the storm's moving relative to the direction of upper level winds in the atmosphere, because shear is when winds in the atmosphere are going against the movement of the storm. So you have a storm, let's say it's moving northwest. If you have upper level winds, so further up in the atmosphere coming in from the southeast to northwest, that's going to create shear, which will try to blow off convection away from the center and thus weaken the storm. So in general, those are some causes of wind shear and really what it does. So when you see National Hurricane Center forecast discussions say, oh, there's going to be an area of 25 to 30 knots of shear, keep in mind that's pretty high. And that would be something that could lead to potential weakening like we saw at the Isaias as it moved over portions of the Bahamas and really kind of almost fell apart at certain points. But when you see them say that there's going to be relatively light shear aloft, like they're saying right now in 13L's discussion, that's typically a favorable thing for storms to use to potentially intensify.
Something that some people have been questioning is the fact that recon showed the mid-level center, which is what we see on satellite, is displaced from the low-level center that they observed.
On which system?
Isaias had a similar on 14. And Isaias had a similar situation when it interacted with Hispaniola, and following that, it became a hurricane. The difference in this situation is that the area of land it's going to be interacting with is very flat, and so won't be able to provide the same topographic forcing that Isaias had that allowed it to strengthen. So it's unlikely to benefit from interacting with land.
Yeah, that's really the best way to put it, really, because there was a lot of discussion when it was still a PTC, Isaias, that if it didn't develop a center before it made a potential kind of center area landfall over Hispaniola, that the interaction with the mountainous terrain, because you got to keep in mind, small island in general, well, at least in comparison to the continent of the North America, but those are some of the most mountainous terrains in the Western Hemisphere right there. Those could cause vorticity and spin to really come up, which is really what happened in the end, because even though Isaias did form a close center of circulation before it made landfall in the Dominican Republic, it really got disintegrated, then a new spin came down, and we had a hurricane, of course, in a very unexpected manner for the most part, really.
Absolutely.
Let's see. So it's like, do you think this system currently forecast to Category 1 could become a major eventually? I think we discussed this a couple times. They're talking about 13L because of that. It's technically possible they come to major, but it is also very important to note that the intensity forecast is much more uncertain than usual because of potential land interaction with Hispaniola and Cuba and just the Greater Antilles in general that could potentially have this thing from anywhere, as we've seen in multiple model spreads for intensity, as weak as a minimal tropical storm to as high as a major hurricane. So if we get really unlucky and this thing gets organized very quickly and is able to stay towards the north and doesn't entrain any dry air and is very well organized when it enters higher areas of ocean heat content and sea surface temperatures where there'll be lower shear, it is possible that it can really ramp up in intensity. But the flip side at the same time, it could really struggle a lot more as well. So just monitor the developments with the system very closely because it isn't really particularly clear quite yet, although there is a wide range of possibilities. Some are definitely better than others.
So a good way to put it would be that we can't rule anything out, but it's got everything to do and everything to lose.
I mean, that really is a good way to put it. It's definitely struggling right now, though, in just general organization. Both it and 14L are really having a rough time getting their act together very early on, for the time being at least. Considering generally favorable conditions for both of them in the interim, 13L especially right now, and 14L up until its first landfall in Central America, and then again for a bit after it reemerges in the Northwestern Caribbean. Both of them will very likely become the next two named storms of the season.
Something that I do note, I'm just looking at the models here. The HWRF model, when it makes the HWRFP model, that is, when it strikes Florida as a hurricane, it has it as a very small system, and most models do indicate that 13 will be quite a compact wind field. Like, we're talking Dorian size before striking the Bahamas. It's
Yeah.
going to be quite tiny.
I mean, that's going to be quite important when we come down to the end of it, because if it can organize very quickly and be a very organized system and a smaller one at the same time, then it's going to probably have a better chance of avoiding some of the dry air entrailment, just because its actual circulation won't be potentially large enough to really reach over into Hispaniola and draw some of that in. But if it's a larger system, like we've seen with some of the storms in both basins, the Atlantic and East Pac, year to date, then there's a higher chance that it could struggle a bit more with some of that dry air factors.
Just having a look at the new... Go ahead, Kay.
Just had a message from someone in the live chat. Thank you for supporting us. They want to know if Tropical Depression 13 would impact Tallahassee.
I mean,
that is actually entirely possible. Go ahead, Wyatt.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I mean, Tallahassee is in the end of the cone, and if you continue with looking where that center is, it's not too far from Tallahassee. So I would keep a very close eye on 13 if you are in Tallahassee, and really anywhere in the Florida Panhandle and Peninsula.
I guess the best way to really phrase it is it's very unclear at this moment exactly what impacts could occur in terms of severity, just because the potential intensity impact or forecast is pretty murky. You know, again, like we said, plenty of times due to potential land interaction that really isn't quite clear yet, and, you know, is making things a bit more difficult for intensity at least. But in general, the actual area where the system's located within the 5-day mark definitely includes Tallahassee. And if you pull out the models a little bit earlier, this storm isn't really expected necessarily to just yoink southwest and try to go towards Mexico instead. So it is definitely possible that mid next week, some impacts in some form are in the area. So definitely stay up to date with the latest information on the storm.
Something that I do know
thing to note with the system.
Go ahead, Kay.
Thank you. An important thing to note with the system is that its size, being small, would make intensity forecasts even less certain, because the models always struggle with small systems and favorable environments. And being small, it would be able to intensify more rapidly, more easily. So once it moves closer to the Bahamas and the Gulf, it's really going to have us watching it like a hawk, because it could blow up at any moment over those incredibly hot sea surface temperatures.
And I don't mean to make a comparison to Andrew, and I know there's been a lot of that, but in terms of it being a small system in that ocean, especially with the upper ocean heat content, I again, like I'm saying, I'm not trying to compare it to Andrew, but it could easily become a major hurricane and really strengthen before making landfall.
Something that I do know on the latest model runs now, including the HWRF model, interestingly enough, for the next 60 hours or so, they really do struggle with 13L. The latest HWRF model takes it just south of Florida as a minimal hurricane. It's not showing a major hurricane, and it moves it over the Keys. But once the system's past the Keys, it is extremely small in size, and it rapidly intensifies it to a 110 knot, 125 mile per hour hurricane bearing down on the Florida Panhandle. So that's a new development.
Yeah. Someone actually really quickly wanted to see the water vapor imagery. I don't know if someone can actually pull that up really quick, just because it gives a better kind of view of the moisture aloft, because I know we've been talking about a lot of, you know, wind shear, sea surface temperatures, land interaction, but of course another factor for these systems is always the air around them right now. If they're in a dry air environment, it's going to be much harder for them to really sustain themselves really than otherwise. And while someone's pulling up as well, another question about 14L actually, asking about the general Houston area right now, if anyone wants to go over that really quickly. I guess in general, really, if you're talking the Houston area, it really ekes into the 5-day cone of uncertainty. But, again, the forecast intensity and exact location isn't really quite clear yet. The 5-day cone ranges from near the Texas-Mexico border all the way towards New Orleans. So the center could be anywhere there. And, of course, impacts extend significantly away from the center for a tropical cyclone. But at least with 14L, keep an eye on it because it's really at the edge and things are a bit uncertain right now with tracking and intensity, a bit more than we'd usually see with the system due to the complex interactions this is going to be having with other systems. But impacts are possible in the area, and you should monitor it closely over the coming days. Ethan, you got some water vapor, right?
I do, yes. You can see just how large the expanse of Tropical Depression 13 is, at least on a majority of it. It doesn't go far off to the west, but on the eastern side in particular, its influence extends pretty much all the way to Haiti, pretty much. It's got quite the large amount of influence, I should say, on it. However, looking off to the east, you can see the absolutely miserable Tropical Depression 13, if I will say so myself. But 13's got a lot of dry air in front of it. But I do note that once the system gets southeast of Andros Island and the Bahamas, the dry air environment does lessen up significantly. So at this point in time, conditions for 13L at least look more favorable when it gets near Florida and into the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, and I guess that's really just generally indicative of the initial slower intensification trend that the National Hurricane Center puts in their forecast cone. They're saying, 2 days from now, this is only going to be at 50 miles an hour, and then it ramps up a little bit more towards the end of the period when the general expectations are still pretty unclear. But 14L, at least you're talking about moisture aloft, is generating a lot of convective activity and moisture with it, which, considering last week this was a system that was just a bit of a low-level swirl with no convective activity, it's got a lot to work with now if it really wants to become a tropical storm before it makes landfall in Central America within the next 12 to 24 hours.
Something I've seen in chats is a person wanting to know about Tampa impacts, specifically 13 moving into the Gulf, intensifying, and then recurving into Tampa. While that can't be ruled out at this time, tropical storm conditions are certainly possible for the Tampa area, and it would be wise to keep monitoring the situation as it becomes more certain within a shorter time frame.
And as I'm from the Tampa Bay area, I was talking with someone else from the area, and Tampa's impacts range as low as tropical storm force winds to Category 2 hurricane force gusts. So honestly, it depends on how it is, but it's still quite a ways out. So
Currently, right now, Tampa is around a 30% chance of tropical storm force winds. I'd imagine that would rise, though.
Yeah, typically as these storms get closer to the land areas, it becomes generally more clear what potential impacts that they may be getting. That's when those odds kick up a bit. In general, the tropical storm conditions, like Ethan said right now, about 30% for Tampa, but those will likely rise. The forecast track becomes more clear, and that enters in to less than 3 days. The exact impacts, though, again, are always important to note. Less clear than usual at that point because the intensity forecast is pretty murky, really, when we're looking at anything from a tropical storm to a major hurricane based on the uncertainty over its land interactions with Hispaniola and Cuba. But the consensus right now is that really at minimum, it'll be around a strong tropical storm at that point, although again, there is a significant spread, so keep an eye out for really either end of those. And that really doesn't discount any potential flooding risk either at that point either. The storm's still in its very early stages of its lifespan right now. It's unclear what structure it'll have exactly in its size, if it'll be smaller or larger really at that point when it gets towards Florida, although some models are trying to say a potentially smaller system. So keep an eye out for that for potential flooding risk associated with the system as well. if there's any saving grace with this system in particular, it's that as we get towards days 4 and 5, it'll be moving pretty quickly in forward speed, meaning that at least the worst impacts from the system won't be staying in that one particular location for the longest period of time compared to a slower moving storm. If you want to compare it to something else this year, say Hannah, which really slowed down to a crawl near landfall, took a while to really move inland, and then really fall away southwest into Mexico. And even then, it was still bringing up new convection into the area it made landfall in for over a day afterwards. This is something you won't really see that with, fortunately.
Mm-hmm. Now, I just want to go over the watches and warnings that we have in effect for both systems. I'll begin with Tropical Depression 13. A tropical storm watch is in effect for Puerto Rico, Vieques, and Culebra, the Virgin Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Saba and St. Eustatius, St. Martin and St. Bartolome, Antigua, Barbuda, St. Kitts, Nevis, and Anguilla. A tropical storm watch means that tropical storm conditions are possible within the watch area, generally within 48 hours. Interests elsewhere in the northern Leeward Islands, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico should monitor the progress of this system, as additional tropical storm watches or warnings will be required for portions of those areas later today. Moving over to Tropical Depression number 14, a tropical storm warning is in effect for the Honduras-Nicaragua border, westward to Punta Cantilas, Honduras, my bad on the pronunciation of that, the islands of Honduras, and Puerto Cabezas, Nicaragua, northward to the Honduras-Nicaragua border, my bad on the pronunciation once again. A tropical storm warning means that tropical storm conditions are expected somewhere within the warning area, in this case within the next 12 hours. Additional watches or warnings, including the Yucatan Peninsula or Mexico, will be required later this evening or tonight. For storm information specific to your area, please monitor products issued by your National Meteorological Service and the National Hurricane Center.
So that's really a good gist of what we got going right now with these two Atlantic systems, their immediate impacts. Because I know we've been talking a lot about potentially down the line for, the United States and places along the Gulf Coast, but both of these really are near impacting land potentially with 13L with those watches in place, or already are impacting land areas like 14L is right now with tropical storm warnings in place. A question to go over really quick as well.
I've been informed that 0Z model guidance is out.
Okay, I don't know if anyone can get that up in a little bit. That'd be great to share as well. Someone's asking really quick, though, about the system in specific. I assume they're talking about Genevieve, if we really want to give this one last glance as kind of a goodbye to the storm as it really begins to fade away and move away from the Baja California Peninsula.
Absolutely. I will absolutely do that because the East Pacific is better than the Atlantic. Yes, I said it. Genevieve continues to weaken. Convection is dying from the storm, unfortunately. Dry air is getting entangled up in the system, as you can see quite clearly on imagery, and sea surface temperatures are decreasing, unfortunately. The storm is forecast to weaken to a tropical depression in around 36 hours by the National Hurricane Center. That forecast seems pretty reasonable, and I would agree with that. And beyond that, 48 hours from now, it'll likely degenerate into a post-tropical cyclone.
Something I've been hearing by word of mouth is that there's been some really significant rainfall over the peninsula and some fairly significant flooding from Genevieve. So it appears that it's been less of a wind threat and more of a rain threat as tropical cyclones of this intensity usually are.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised by that at all, considering, really, rain bands only really left the southern tip of the Baja California Peninsula, where this really began impacting land 36 hours ago or so, really within the past 3 hours. So the potential for very significant rainfall to have likely occurred is there with this system. And if we get any more confirmed reports about that, you'll probably see some sort of posts from us on social media, on Twitter or Facebook tonight discussing that, or just giving a general notice of the occurrence of that as well. But at least for the future of Genevieve, you can see the model spread on the screen in the bottom right corner. All downhill from here, really, with the system. Interestingly, though, as we get a bit further down the line, as just a remnant low, if it has any rain with it left, it could try to bring some moisture up into the west coast of the United States, although that's a bit more murky as well. In general, what's left of it should try to make some sort of weird turn-off slowly towards the northeast and potentially try to bring some rainfall if it has any associated activity left with it at that time. Ethan, you had these new model spreads out for one of the systems?
I do, yes. This is the 18Z guidance that I'm just going to compare it to real quick. You can see in the 60-hour mark, they were forecasting it to be a much stronger storm around 60, 65 miles per hour. You can get up to hurricane in the HWRF model there. And the 0Z model guidance is looking like this. Looking much weaker in the 60-hour time frame. But as you can see, HWRF hinting that it'll pass by Florida around 84 hours as a 80, 85 mile per hour hurricane, and then rapidly intensifying to major hurricane status in the Gulf of Mexico. So I'd imagine the National Hurricane Center will probably upgrade to 80 miles per hour at the next forecast. Probably.
I do think this graphic in particular, though, does a really good job at highlighting the really high levels of uncertainty still, because you have some of the global models, including the GFS there, saying that it won't even be a tropical storm at day 5, although it really is struggling with the general initialization right now. Regardless of that, there is a good chunk of models that keep it way weaker as we head off, and then you have the HWRF and the CTCI really going up there, trying to make this a strong storm. So that really highlights the uncertainty of this system, and again, the important note that people in Florida, in Cuba, the Bahamas, Turks and Caicos, and portions of the southeastern United States should be monitoring developments of the system very closely to see what potential impacts become more likely or less likely for their exact location. Someone's asking a question, this is good for the short term for the system as well, about potential impacts for the Puerto Rican area as well as the Virgin Islands, both of which are actually under tropical storm watches right now. I think the best way to really answer that is taking a look at some of the rainfall forecasts. And I don't know if you can pull it up really quickly, Ethan, but it is important to note, they are under a tropical storm watch for a reason, those areas, which means that generally the odds of tropical storm conditions are possible within the next 48 hours or so. So I'd definitely keep that in mind if you're there and watching the storm, that in general, when you're under a watch, you should be taking the proper precautions and preparations and listening to local officials for more information on your exact location to get the exact best information about what you should be doing, because it is possible the storm either stays too small and lifts off to the north, or it could be much more organized and a bit further to the south as well. Really either or. And even if it's disorganized, some of its convective activity can stay far enough south to where some impacts are occurring over the areas, which is why there's watches there. Generally, computer models are indicating that 1 to 2 inches of rainfall are possible across portions of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands associated with this system, but that really depends on your exact location. Of course, more mountainous areas can ring out some more rainfall as well.
With rainfall, the National Hurricane Center says that maximum totals of 3 to 6 inches over Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands through Sunday. So, and 3 to 6 inches of rain doesn't sound like much, but it can be a lot, especially with mountainous islands like Puerto Rico.
Yeah, and that's going to be in those more mountainous areas, really. They can ring out a lot in a pretty short period of time, really. Those topographic higher mountain areas can bring a lot more rainfall down than you'd really want to see in a short period of time. So the risk for flash flooding and mudslides definitely there for those areas. Broader areas will see most likely a bit less than that. But if you're getting 3 to 6 areas of rainfall from a system right now that's moving close to 20 miles an hour, the last update, 8 p.m., has it moving at 21 miles an hour, you're going to see potentially that come down in a relatively short time frame. When you see rain rates of 1 to 2 inches an hour in those isolated places, then you got to have a concern for potential flash flooding. Let's see, really quick, we're about to run out of time as well, so I want to do a couple more questions really quick. So someone's asking, doesn't it depend all on where the track and center is at the moment? I would say, I think this is really the best descriptor for not only the systems in the Atlantic right now, but also 90W in the Pacific, that their exact center location right now doesn't really matter as much as where it will be within the next 48 to 72 hours. That's where things get pretty uncertain for the systems heading forward, exactly on how strong and intense they'll be, as well as their exact locations. So keeping that in mind, it's always important to note that the uncertainty is there, and if you're in the 5-day cone or generally near it, you should be paying attention to your local officials, National Hurricane Center, of course, and media sources to get the latest information on these systems and their potential impacts that they could bring to your region. I think we're running out of time right now, actually. It's about the top of the hour, so I do really want to say thank you to everyone for coming out tonight to be here with us during this brief tropical weather bulletin live style. It's been great to have the team here discussing everything, really, as we're about to sign off for the night. We'll probably have at least one video update tomorrow covering both systems in general, as well as either a live tropical weather bulletin again or a regular tropical weather bulletin at its normal time around 8 p.m. or so. So again, thank you so much for watching, guys. Links in the description below to further communication with us in any way that you want. Discord servers there, always completely wonderful, really. A beautiful place to be and communicate with hundreds of other weather enthusiasts. Always make sure to subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with the latest with these storms. And thanks for watching. And really, thank you so much to the team for being here tonight.